Perhaps he would walk if his feet were unfastened, said Herbert. Let us try, replied Pencroft. The cords which shackled the prisoner's feet were cut off, but his arms remained securely fastened. He got up by himself and did not manifest any desire to run away. His hard eyes darted a piercing glance at the three men who walked near him, but nothing denoted that he recollected being their fellow, or at least having been so. A continual hissing sound issued from his lips. His aspect was wild, but he did not attempt to resist. By the reporter's advice, the unfortunate man was taken to the hut. Perhaps the sight of the things that belonged to him would make some impression on him. Perhaps a spark would be sufficient to revive his obscured intellect, to rekindle his dulled soul. The dwelling was not far off. In a few minutes they arrived there, but the prisoner remembered nothing, and it appeared that he had lost consciousness of everything. What could they think of the degree of brutishness into which this miserable being had fallen, unless that his imprisonment on the islet dated from a very distant period, and after having arrived there, a rational being's solitude had reduced him to this condition. The reporter then thought that perhaps the sight of fire would have some effect on him, and in a moment one of those beautiful flames that attract even animals blazed up on the hearth. The sight of the flame seemed at first to fix the attention of the unhappy object, but soon he turned away and the look of intelligence faded. Evidently there was nothing to be done, for the time at least, but to take him on board the Bonadventure. This was done, and he remained there in Pencroft's charge. Herbert and Spilett returned to finish their work, and some hours after they came back to the shore, carrying the utensils and guns, a store of vegetables, of seeds, some game, and 2 couple of pigs. All was embarked, and the Bonadventure was ready to weigh anchor and sail with the morning tide. The prisoner had been placed in the fore cabin, where he remained quiet, silent, apparently deaf and dumb. Pencroft offered him something to eat, but he pushed away the cooked meat that was presented to him and which doubtless did not suit him. But on the sailor showing him one of the ducks which Herbert had killed, he pounced on it like a wild beast and devoured it greedily. "You think that he will recover his senses?" asked Pencroft. "It is not impossible that our care will have an effect upon him, for it is solitude that has made him what he is, and from this time forward he will be no longer alone." "The poor man must no doubt have been in this state for a long time," said Herbert. "Perhaps," answered Gideon Spilett. "About what age is he?" asked the lad. "It is difficult to say," replied the reporter, "for it is impossible to see his features under the thick beard which covers his face, but he is no longer young, and I suppose he might be about 50. "Have you noticed, Mr. Spilett, how deeply sunk his eyes are?" asked Herbert. "Yes, Herbert, but I must add that they are more human than one could expect from his appearance." "However, we shall see," replied Pencroft, "and I am anxious to know what opinion Captain Harding will have of our savage. We went to look for a human creature, and we are bringing back a monster. After all, we did what we could." The night passed, and whether the prisoner slept or not could not be known, but at any rate, although he had been unbound, he did not move. He was like a wild animal, which appears stunned at first by its capture and becomes wild again afterwards. At daybreak the next morning, the 15th of October, the change of weather predicted by Pencroft occurred. The wind, having shifted to the northwest, favored the return of the Bonadventure, but at the same time it freshened, which would render navigation more difficult. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the anchor was weighed. Pencroft took a reef in the mainsail and steered towards the northeast so as to sail straight for Lincoln Island. The first day of the voyage was not marked by any incident. The prisoner remained quiet in the fore cabin, and as he had been a sailor, it appeared that the motion of the vessel might produce on him a salutary reaction. Did some recollection of his former calling return to him, however that might be, he remained tranquil, astonished rather than depressed. The next day the wind increased, blowing more from the north, consequently in a less favorable direction for the Bonadventure. Pencroft was soon obliged to sail close-hauled, and without saying anything about it, he began to be uneasy at the state of the sea, which frequently broke over the bows. Certainly, if the wind did not moderate, it would take a longer time to reach Lincoln Island than it had taken to make Tabor Island. Indeed, on the morning of the 17th, the Bonadventure had been 48 hours at sea, and nothing showed that she was near the island. It was impossible, besides, to estimate the distance traversed, or to trust to the reckoning for the direction, as the speed had been very irregular. 24 hours after there was yet no land in sight, the wind was right ahead and the sea very heavy. The sails were close-reefed, and they tacked frequently. On the 18th, a wave swept completely over the Bonadventure, and if the crew had not taken the precaution of lashing themselves to the deck, they would have been carried away. On this occasion, Pencroft and his companions, who were occupied with loosing themselves, received unexpected aid from the prisoner, who emerged from the hatchway as if his sailor's instinct had suddenly returned, broke a piece out of the bulwarks with a spar so as to let the water which filled the deck escape. Then, the vessel being clear, he descended to his cabin without having uttered a word. Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert, greatly astonished, let him proceed. Their situation was truly serious, and the sailor had reason to fear that he was lost on the wide sea without any possibility of recovering his course. The night was dark and cold. However, about 11 o'clock, the wind fell, the sea went down, and the speed of the vessel, as she labored less, greatly increased. Neither Pencroft, Spilett, nor Herbert thought of taking an hour's sleep. They kept a sharp lookout, for either Lincoln Island could not be far distant and would be sighted at daybreak, or the Bonadventure, carried away by currents, had drifted so much that it would be impossible to rectify her course. Pencroft, uneasy to the last degree, yet did not despair, for he had a gallant heart, and grasping the tiller he anxiously endeavored to pierce the darkness which surrounded them. About 2 o'clock in the morning, he started forward. "A light," he shouted. Indeed, a bright light appeared 20 miles to the northeast. Lincoln Island was there, and this fire, evidently lighted by Cyrus Harding, showed them the course to be followed. Pencroft, who was bearing too much to the north, altered his course and steered towards the fire, which burned brightly above the horizon like a star of the first magnitude. "A light, a light, a light, a light." Chapter 15. The return discussion, Cyrus Harding and the stranger Port Balloon, the engineer's devotion, a touching incident, tears flow. The next day, the 20th of October, at 7 o'clock in the morning, after a voyage of 4 days, the Bonadventure gently glided up to the beach at the mouth of the Mersey. Cyrus Harding and Neb, who had become very uneasy at the bad weather and the prolonged absence of their companions, had climbed at daybreak to the plateau of Prospect Heights, and they had at last caught sight of the vessel which had been so long in returning. "God be praised, there they are," exclaimed Cyrus Harding. As to Neb in his joy, he began to dance, to twirl round, clapping his hands and shouting, "Oh, my master!" a more touching pantomime than the finest discourse. The engineer's first idea, on counting the people on the deck of the Bonadventure, was that Pencroft had not found the castaway of Tabor Island, or at any rate that the unfortunate man had refused to leave his island and change one prison for another. Indeed, Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert were alone on the deck of the Bonadventure. The moment the vessel touched, the engineer and Neb were waiting on the beach, and before the passengers had time to leap on to the sand, Harding said, "We have been very uneasy at your delay, my friends. Did you meet with any accident?" "No," replied Gideon Spilett. "On the contrary, everything went wonderfully well. We will tell you all about it." "However," returned the engineer, "your search has been unsuccessful, since you are only 3 just as you went." "Excuse me, Captain," replied the sailor, "we are 4. "You have found the castaway?" "Yes." "And you have brought him?" "Yes." "Living?" "Yes." "Where is he? Who is he?" "He is," replied the reporter, "or rather he was, a man. There's Cyrus, that is all we can tell you." The engineer was then informed of all that had passed during the voyage, and under what conditions the search had been conducted, how the only dwelling in the island had long been abandoned, how at last a castaway had been captured who appeared no longer to belong to the human species. "And that's just the point," added Pencroft. "I don't know if we have done right to bring him here." "Certainly you have, Pencroft," replied the engineer quickly. "But the wretched creature has no sense." "That is possible at present," replied Cyrus Harding, "but only a few months ago the wretched creature was a man like you and me, and who knows what will become of the survivor of us after a long solitude on this island. It is a great misfortune to be alone, my friends, and it must be believed that solitude can quickly destroy reason, since you have found this poor creature in such a state." "But, Captain," asked Herbert, "what leads you to think that the brutishness of the unfortunate man began only a few months back?" "Because the document we found had been recently written," answered the engineer, "and the castaway alone can have written it." "Always supposing," observed Gideon Spilett, "that it had not been written by a companion of this man, since dead." "That is impossible, my dear Spilett." "Why so?" asked the reporter. "Because the document would then have spoken of 2 castaways," replied Harding, "and it mentioned only one." Herbert then, in a few words, related the incidents of the voyage, and dwelt on the curious fact of the sort of passing gleam in the prisoner's mind, when for an instant in the height of the storm he had become a sailor. "Well, Herbert," replied the engineer, "you are right to attach great importance to this fact. The unfortunate man cannot be incurable, and despair has made him what he is. But here he will find his fellow-men, and since there is still a soul in him, this soul we shall save." The castaway of Tabor Island, to the great pity of the engineer and the great astonishment of Neb, was then brought from the cabin which he occupied in the forepart of the Bonadventure. When once on land, he manifested a wish to run away. But Cyrus Harding, approaching, placed his hand on his shoulder with a gesture full of authority, and looked at him with infinite tenderness. Immediately the unhappy man, submitting to a superior will, gradually became calm. His eyes fell, his head bent, and he made no more resistance. "Poor fellow," murmured the engineer. Cyrus Harding had attentively observed him. To judge by his appearance, this miserable being had no longer anything human about him, and yet Harding, as had the reporter already, observed in his look an indefinable trace of intelligence. It was decided that the castaway, or rather the stranger, as he was thenceforth termed by his companions, should live in one of the rooms of Granite House, from which, however, he could not escape. He was led there without difficulty, and with careful attention. It might, perhaps, be hoped that some day he would be a companion to the settlers in Lincoln Island. Cyrus Harding, during breakfast, which Neb had hastened to prepare, as the reporter, Herbert, and Pencroft were dying of hunger, heard in detail all the incidents which had marked the voyage of exploration to the islet. He agreed with his friends on this point, that the stranger must be either English or American, the name Britannia leading them to suppose this, and besides, through the bushy beard, and under the shaggy, matted hair, the engineer thought he could recognize the characteristic features of the Anglo-Saxon. Murmured the engineer. "Poor fellow," murmured the engineers. "But by the by," said Gideon Spilett, addressing Herbert, "you never told us how you met this savage, and we know nothing except that you would have been strangled if we had not happened to come up in time to help you." "Upon my word," answered Herbert, "it is rather difficult to say how it happened. I was, I think, occupied in collecting my plants when I heard a noise like an avalanche falling from a very tall tree. I scarcely had time to look round. This unfortunate man, who was without doubt concealed in a tree, rushed upon me in less time than I take to tell you about it, and unless Mr. Spilett and Pencroft." "My boy," said Cyrus Harding, "you ran a great danger, but perhaps without that, the poor creature would have still hidden himself from your search, and we should not have had a new companion." "You hope, then, Cyrus, to succeed in reforming the man?" asked the reporter. "Yes," replied the engineer. Breakfast over, Harding and his companions left Granite House and returned to the beach. They there occupied themselves in unloading the Bonadventure, and the engineer, having examined the arms and tools, saw nothing which could help them to establish the identity of the stranger. The capture of pigs, made on the islet, was looked upon as being very profitable to Lincoln Island, and the animals were led to the sty, where they soon became at home. The 2 barrels containing the powder and shot, as well as the box of caps, were very welcome. It was agreed to establish a small powder magazine either outside Granite House or in the upper cavern, where there would be no fear of explosion. However, the use of pyroxyle was to be continued, for this substance giving excellent results, there was no reason for substituting ordinary powder. When the unloading of the vessel was finished, "Captain," said Pencroft, "I think it would be prudent to put our Bonadventure in a safe place." "Is she not safe at the mouth of the Mersey?" asked Cyrus Harding. "No, Captain," replied the sailor. "Half of the time she is stranded on the sand, and that works her. She is a famous craft, you see, and she behaved admirably during the squall which struck us on our return." "Could she not float in the river?" "No doubt, Captain, she could, but there is no shelter there, and in the east winds, I think that the Bonadventure would suffer much from the surf." "Well, where would you put her, Pencroft?" "In Port Balloon," replied the sailor. "That little creek, shut in by rocks, seems to me to be just the harbor we want." "Is it not rather far?" "Pooh, it is not more than 3 miles from Granite House, and we have a fine straight road to take us there." "Do it then, Pencroft, and take your Bonadventure there," replied the engineer, "and yet I would rather have her under our more immediate protection. When we have time, we must make a little harbor for her." "Famous!" exclaimed Pencroft. "A harbor with a lighthouse, a pier, and a dock. Ah, really with you, Captain, everything becomes easy." "Yes, my brave Pencroft," answered the engineer, "but on condition, however, that you help me, for you do as much as 3 men in all our work." Herbert and the sailor then re-embarked on board the Bonadventure. The anchor was weighed, the sail hoisted, and the wind drove her rapidly towards Claw Cape. 2 hours after, she was reposing on the tranquil waters of Port Balloon. During the first days passed by the stranger in Granite House, had he already given them reason to think that his savage nature was becoming tamed? Did a brighter light burn in the depths of that obscured mind? In short, was the soul returning to the body? Yes, to a certainty, and to such a degree that Cyrus Harding and the reporter wondered if the reason of the unfortunate man had ever been totally extinguished. At first, accustomed to the open air, to the unrestrained liberty which he had enjoyed on Tabor Island, the stranger manifested a sullen fury, and it was feared that he might throw himself on to the beach, out of one of the windows of Granite House. But gradually he became calmer, and more freedom was allowed to his movements. They had reason to hope, and to hope much. Already, forgetting his carnivorous instincts, the stranger accepted a less bestial nourishment than that on which he fed on the islet, and cooked meat did not produce in him the same sentiment of repulsion which he had showed on board the Bonadventure. Cyrus Harding had profited by a moment when he was sleeping to cut his hair and matted beard, which formed a sort of mane, and gave him such a savage aspect. He had also been clothed more suitably after having got rid of the rag which covered him. The result was that, thanks to these attentions, the stranger resumed a more human appearance, and it even seemed as if his eyes had become milder. Certainly, when formerly lighted up by intelligence, this man's face must have had a sort of beauty. Every day Harding imposed on himself the task of passing some hours in his company. He came and worked near him, and occupied himself in different things so as to fix his attention. A spark, indeed, would be sufficient to illumine that soul, a recollection crossing that brain to recall reason. That had been seen, during the storm, on board the Bonadventure. The engineer did not neglect either to speak aloud, so as to penetrate at the same time by the organs of hearing and sight the depths of that torpid intelligence. Sometimes one of his companions, sometimes another, sometimes all joined him. They spoke most often of things belonging to the Navy, which must interest a sailor. At times the stranger gave some slight attention to what was said, and the settlers were soon convinced that he partly understood them. Sometimes the expression of his countenance was deeply sorrowful, a proof that he suffered mentally, for his face could not be mistaken. But he did not speak, although at different times, however, they almost thought that words were about to issue from his lips. At all events, the poor creature was quite quiet and sad. But was not his calm only apparent? Was not his sadness only the result of his seclusion? Nothing could yet be ascertained. Seeing only certain objects, and in a limited space, always in contact with the colonists, to whom he would soon become accustomed, having no desires to satisfy, better fed, better clothed, it was natural that his physical nature should gradually improve. But was he penetrated with the sense of a new life, or rather, to employ a word which would be exactly applicable to him, was he not becoming tamed, like an animal in company with his master? This was an important question, which Cyrus Harding was anxious to answer, and yet he did not wish to treat his invalid roughly. Would he ever be a convalescent? How the engineer observed him every moment, how he was on the watch for his soul, if one may use the expression, how he was ready to grasp it. The settlers followed with real sympathy all the phases of the cure undertaken by Harding. They aided him also in this work of humanity, and all, except perhaps the incredulous Pencroft, soon shared both his hope and his faith. The calm of the stranger was deep, as has been said, and he even showed a sort of attachment for the engineer, whose influence he evidently felt. Cyrus Harding resolved then to try him, by transporting him to another scene, from that ocean which formerly his eyes had been accustomed to contemplate, to the border of the forest, which might perhaps recall those where so many years of his life had been passed. But, said Gideon Spilett, can we hope that he will not escape if once set at liberty? The experiment must be tried, replied the engineer. Well, said Pencroft, when that fellow is outside and feels the fresh air, he will be off as fast as his legs can carry him. I do not think so, returned Harding. Let us try, said Spilett. We will try, replied the engineer. This was on the 30th of October, and consequently the castaway of Tabor Island had been a prisoner in Granite House for 9 days. It was warm, and a bright sun darted his rays on the island. Cyrus Harding and Pencroft went to the room occupied by the stranger, who was found lying near the window and gazing at the sky. Come, my friend, said the engineer to him. The stranger rose immediately. His eyes were fixed on Cyrus Harding, and he followed him, whilst the sailor marched behind them, little confident as to the result of the experiment. Arrived at the door, Harding and Pencroft made him take his place in the lift, whilst Neb, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett waited for them before Granite House. The lift descended, and in a few moments all were united on the beach. The settlers went a short distance from the stranger, so as to leave him at liberty. He then made a few steps towards the sea, and his look brightened with extreme animation, but he did not make the slightest attempt to escape. He was gazing at the little waves, which, broken by the islet, rippled on the sand. This is only the sea, observed Gideon Spilett, and possibly it does not inspire him with any wish to escape. Yes, replied Harding, we must take him to the plateau on the border of the forest. There the experiment will be more conclusive. Besides, he could not run away, said Neb, since the bridge is raised. Oh, said Pencroft, that isn't a man to be troubled by a stream like Creek Glycerine. He could cross it directly at a single bound. We shall soon see, Harding contented himself with replying, his eyes not quitting those of his patient. The latter was then led towards the mouth of the Mersey, and all climbing the left bank of the river, reached Prospect Heights. Arrived at the spot on which grew the first beautiful trees of the forest, their foliage slightly agitated by the breeze, the stranger appeared greedily to drink in the penetrating odor which filled the atmosphere, and a long sigh escaped from his chest. The settlers kept behind him, ready to seize him if he made any movement to escape. And indeed, the poor creature was on the point of springing into the creek which separated him from the forest, and his legs were bent for an instant as if for a spring, but almost immediately he stepped back, half sank down, and a large tear fell from his eyes. "Ah," exclaimed Cyrus Harding, "you have become a man again, for you can weep." The experiment, the experiment. Chapter 16. A mystery to be cleared up. The stranger's first words, 12 years on the islet, avowal which escapes him, the disappearance, Cyrus Harding's confidence, construction of a mill, the first bread, an act of devotion, honest hands. Yes, the unfortunate man had wept. Some recollection doubtless had flashed across his brain, and to use Cyrus Harding's expression, by those tears he was once more a man. The colonists left him for some time on the plateau and withdrew themselves to a short distance, so that he might feel himself free, but he did not think of profiting by this liberty, and Harding soon brought him back to Granite House. 2 days after this occurrence, the stranger appeared to wish gradually to mingle with their common life. He evidently heard and understood, but no less evidently was he strangely determined not to speak to the colonists. For one evening, Pencroft, listening at the door of his room, heard these words escape from his lips. "No, here I never." The sailor reported these words to his companions. "There is some painful mystery there," said Harding. The stranger had begun to use the laboring tools, and he worked in the garden. When he stopped in his work, as was often the case, he remained retired within himself, but on the engineer's recommendation, they respected the reserve which he apparently wished to keep. If one of the settlers approached him, he drew back, and his chest heaved with sobs as if overburthened. Was it remorse that overwhelmed him thus? They were compelled to believe so, and Gideon Spilett could not help one day making this observation. "If he does not speak, it is because he has, I fear, things too serious to be told. They must be patient and wait." He asked in a hollow voice, "Who are you?" He asked in a hollow voice. A few days later, on the 3rd of November, the stranger, working on the plateau, had stopped, letting his spade drop to the ground, and Harding, who was observing him from a little distance, saw that tears were again flowing from his eyes. A sort of irresistible pity led him towards the unfortunate man, and he touched his arm lightly. "My friend," said he. The stranger tried to avoid his look, and Cyrus Harding, having endeavored to take his hand, he drew back quickly. "My friend," said Harding in a firmer voice, "look at me, I wish it." The stranger looked at the engineer and seemed to be under his power as a subject under the influence of a mesmerist. He wished to run away, but then his countenance suddenly underwent a transformation. His eyes flashed, words struggled to escape from his lips. He could no longer contain himself. At last he folded his arms, then, in a hollow voice, "Who are you?" he asked Cyrus Harding. "Castaways like you," replied the engineer, whose emotion was deep. "We have brought you here among your fellow-men." "My fellow-men, I have none." "You are in the midst of friends." "Friends for me, friends," exclaimed the stranger, hiding his face in his hands. "No, never leave me, leave me." Then he rushed to the side of the plateau which overlooked the sea, and remained there a long time motionless. Harding rejoined his companions and related to them what had just happened. "Yes, there is some mystery in that man's life," said Gideon Spilett, "and it appears as if he had only re-entered society by the path of remorse." "I don't know what sort of a man we have brought here," said the sailor. "He has secrets." "Which we will respect," interrupted Cyrus Harding quickly. "If he has committed any crime, he has most fearfully expiated it, and in our eyes he is absolved." The stranger, the stranger. For 2 hours the stranger remained alone on the shore, evidently under the influence of recollections which recalled all his past life, a melancholy life doubtless, and the colonists, without losing sight of him, did not attempt to disturb his solitude. However, after 2 hours, appearing to have formed a resolution, he came to find Cyrus Harding. His eyes were red with the tears he had shed, but he wept no longer. His countenance expressed deep humility. He appeared anxious, timorous, ashamed, and his eyes were constantly fixed on the ground. "Sir," said he to Harding, your companions and you, are you English?" "No," answered the engineer, "we are Americans." "Ah," said the stranger, and he murmured, "I prefer that." "And you, my friend?" asked the engineer. "English," replied he hastily. And as if these few words had been difficult to say, he retreated to the beach, where he walked up and down between the cascade and the mouth of the Mersey, in a state of extreme agitation. Then, passing one moment close to Herbert, he stopped, and in a stifled voice, "What month?" he asked. "December," replied Herbert. "What year?" 1866. 12 years," he exclaimed. Then he left him abruptly. Herbert reported to the colonists the questions and answers which had been made. "This unfortunate man," observed Gideon Spilett, "was no longer acquainted with either months or years." "Yes," added Herbert, "and he had been 12 years already on the islet when we found him there." 12 years, rejoined Harding. "Ah, 12 years of solitude, after a wicked life perhaps, may well impair a man's reason." "I am induced to think," said Pencroft, "that this man was not wrecked on Tabor Island, but that in consequence of some crime he was left there." "You must be right, Pencroft," replied the reporter, "and if it is so, it is not impossible that those who left him on the island may return to fetch him some day." "And they will no longer find him," said Herbert. "But then," added Pencroft, "they must return and—" "My friends," said Cyrus Harding, "do not let us discuss this question until we know more about it. I believe that the unhappy man has suffered, that he has severely expiated his faults, whatever they may have been, and that the wish to unburden himself stifles him. Do not let us press him to tell us his history. He will tell it to us doubtless, and when we know it, we shall see what course it will be best to follow. He alone besides can tell us if he has more than a hope, a certainty, of returning some day to his country, but I doubt it." "And why?" asked the reporter. "Because that, in the event of his being sure of being delivered at a certain time, he would have waited the hour of his deliverance, and would not have thrown this document into the sea. No, it is more probable that he was condemned to die on that islet, and that he never expected to see his fellow creatures again." "But," observed the sailor, "there is one thing which I cannot explain." "What is it?" "If this man had been left for 12 years on Tabor Island, one may well suppose that he had been several years already in the wild state in which we found him." "That is probable," replied Cyrus Harding. "It must then be many years since he wrote that document." "No doubt, and yet the document appears to have been recently written. Besides, how do you know that the bottle which enclosed the document may not have taken several years to come from Tabor Island to Lincoln Island?" "That is not absolutely impossible," replied the reporter. "Might it not have been a long time already on the coast of the island?" "No," answered Pencroft, "for it was still floating. We could not even suppose that after it had stayed for any length of time on the shore, it would have been swept off by the sea, for the south coast is all rocks, and it would certainly have been smashed to pieces there." "That is true," rejoined Cyrus Harding thoughtfully. "And then," continued the sailor, "if the document was several years old, if it had been shut up in that bottle for several years, it would have been injured by damp. Now, there is nothing of the kind, and it was found in a perfect state of preservation." The sailor's reasoning was very just, and pointed out an incomprehensible fact, for the document appeared to have been recently written when the colonists found it in the bottle. Moreover, it gave the latitude and longitude of Tabor Island correctly, which implied that its author had a more complete knowledge of hydrography than could be expected of a common sailor. "There is in this, again, something unaccountable," said the engineer, "but we will not urge our companion to speak. When he likes, my friends, then we shall be ready to hear him." During the following days the stranger did not speak a word, and did not once leave the precincts of the plateau. He worked away, without losing a moment, without taking a minute's rest, but always in a retired place. At mealtimes, he never came to Granite House, although invited several times to do so, but contented himself with eating a few raw vegetables. At nightfall, he did not return to the room assigned to him, but remained under some clump of trees, or when the weather was bad crouched in some cleft of the rocks. Thus he lived in the same manner as when he had no other shelter than the forests of Tabor Island, and as all persuasion to induce him to improve his life was in vain, the colonists waited patiently, and the time was near when, as it seemed, almost involuntarily urged by his conscience, a terrible confession escaped him. On the 10th of November, about 8 o'clock in the evening, as night was coming on, the stranger appeared unexpectedly before the settlers, who were assembled under the veranda. His eyes burned strangely, and he had quite resumed the wild aspect of his worst days. Cyrus Harding and his companions were astounded on seeing that, overcome by some terrible emotion, his teeth chattered like those of a person in a fever. What was the matter with him? Was the sight of his fellow creatures insupportable to him? Was he weary of this return to a civilized mode of existence? Was he pining for his former savage life? It appeared so, as soon he was heard to express himself in these incoherent sentences. "Why am I here? By what right have you dragged me from my islet? Do you think there could be any tie between you and me? Do you know who I am, what I have done, why I was there, alone? And who told you that I was not abandoned there, that I was not condemned to die there? Do you know my past? How do you know that I have not stolen, murdered, that I am not a wretch, an accursed being, only fit to live like a wild beast far from all speak? Do you know it?" The colonists listened without interrupting the miserable creature, from whom these broken confessions escaped, as it were, in spite of himself. Harding, wishing to calm him, approached him, but he hastily drew back. "No, no," he exclaimed, "one word only, am I free?" "You are free," answered the engineer. "Farewell then," he cried, and fled like a madman. Neb, Pencroft, and Herbert ran also towards the edge of the wood, but they returned alone. "We must let him alone," said Cyrus Harding. "He will never come back," exclaimed Pencroft. "He will come back," replied the engineer. Many days passed, but Harding, was it a sort of presentiment, persisted in the fixed idea that sooner or later the unhappy man would return. "It is the last revolt of his wild nature," said he, "which remorse has touched, and which renewed solitude will terrify." In the meanwhile, works of all sorts were continued, as well on Prospect Heights as at the corral, where Harding intended to build a farm. It is unnecessary to say that the seeds collected by Herbert on Tabor Island had been carefully sown. The plateau thus formed one immense kitchen garden, well laid out and carefully tended, so that the arms of the settlers were never in want of work. There was always something to be done. As the esculents increased in number, it became necessary to enlarge the simple beds, which threatened to grow into regular fields and replace the meadows. But grass abounded in other parts of the island, and there was no fear of the onagas being obliged to go on short allowance. It was well worth while, besides, to turn Prospect Heights into a kitchen garden, defended by its deep belt of creeks, and to remove them to the meadows, which had no need of protection against the depredations of quadrumana and quadrupeds. On the 15th of November, the third harvest was gathered in. How wonderfully had the field increased in extent since 18 months ago, when the first grain of wheat was sown. The second crop of 600,000 grains produced this time 4,000 bushels, or 500 millions of grains. The colony was rich in corn, for 10 bushels alone were sufficient for sowing every year to produce an ample crop for the food both of men and beasts. The harvest was completed, and the last fortnight of the month of November was devoted to the work of converting it into food for man. In fact, they had corn, but not flour, and the establishment of a mill was necessary. Cyrus Harding could have utilized the second fall, which flowed into the Mersey, to establish his motive power, the first being already occupied with moving the felting mill. But after some consultation, it was decided that a simple windmill should be built on Prospect Heights. The building of this presented no more difficulty than the building of the former, and it was moreover certain that there would be no want of wind on the plateau, exposed as it was to the sea breezes. "Not to mention," said Pencroft, "that the windmill will be more lively and will have a good effect in the landscape. They set to work by choosing timber for the frame and machinery of the mill. Some large stones, found at the north of the lake, could be easily transformed into millstones, and as to the sails, the inexhaustible case of the balloon furnished the necessary material. Cyrus Harding made his model, and the site of the mill was chosen a little to the right of the poultry yard, near the shore of the lake. The frame was to rest on a pivot supported with strong timbers, so that it could turn with all the machinery it contained according as the wind required it. The work advanced rapidly. Neb and Pencroft had become very skillful carpenters, and had nothing to do but to copy the models provided by the engineer. Soon a sort of cylindrical box, in shape like a pepper pot, with a pointed roof, rose on the spot chosen. The 4 frames which formed the sails had been firmly fixed in the center beam, so as to form a certain angle with it, and secured with iron clamps. As to the different parts of the internal mechanism, the box destined to contain the 2 millstones, the fixed stone and the moving stone, the hopper, a sort of large square trough, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, which would allow the grain to fall on the stones, the oscillating spout intended to regulate the passing of the grain, and lastly the bolting machine, which by the operation of sifting separates the bran from the flour, were made without difficulty. The tools were good, and the work not difficult, for in reality the machinery of a mill is very simple. This was only a question of time. Everyone had worked at the construction of the mill, and on the 1st of December it was finished. As usual, Pencroft was delighted with his work, and had no doubt that the apparatus was perfect. "Now for a good wind," said he, "and we shall grind our first harvest splendidly." "A good wind, certainly," answered the engineer, "but not too much, Pencroft." "Pooh, our mill would only go the faster." "There is no need for it to go so very fast," replied Cyrus Harding. "It is known by experience that the greatest quantity of work is performed by a mill when the number of turns made by the sails in a minute is 6 times the number of feet traversed by the wind in a second. A moderate breeze, which passes over 24 feet to the second, will give 16 turns to the sails during a minute, and there is no need of more." "Exactly," cried Herbert. "A fine breeze is blowing from the northeast, which will soon do our business for us." There was no reason for delaying the inauguration of the mill, for the settlers were eager to taste the first piece of bread in Lincoln Island. On this morning 2 or 3 bushels of wheat were ground, and the next day at breakfast a magnificent loaf, a little heavy perhaps, although raised with yeast, appeared on the table at Granite House. Every one munched away at it with a pleasure which may be easily understood. In the meanwhile, the stranger had not reappeared. Several times Gideon Spilett and Herbert searched the forest in the neighborhood of Granite House, without meeting or finding any trace of him. They became seriously uneasy at this prolonged absence. Certainly the former savage of Tabor Island could not be perplexed how to live in the forest, abounding in game, but was it not to be feared that he had resumed his habits, and that this freedom would revive in him his wild instincts? However, Harding, by a sort of presentiment, doubtless, always persisted in saying that the fugitive would return. "Yes, he will return," he repeated with a confidence which his companions could not share. When this unfortunate man was on Tabor Island, he knew himself to be alone. Here, he knows that fellow men are awaiting him. Since he has partially spoken of his past life, the poor penitent will return to tell the whole, and from that day he will belong to us. The event justified Cyrus Harding's predictions. On the 3rd of December, Herbert had left the plateau to go and fish on the southern bank of the lake. He was unarmed, and till then had never taken any precautions for defense, as dangerous animals had not shown themselves on that part of the island. Meanwhile, Pencroft and Neb were working in the poultry yard, whilst Harding and the reporter were occupied at the chimneys in making soda, the store of soap being exhausted. Suddenly cries resounded. "Help! Help!" Cyrus Harding and the reporter, being at too great a distance, had not been able to hear the shouts. Pencroft and Neb, leaving the poultry yard in all haste, rushed towards the lake. "Now for a good wind, now for a good wind!" But before them, the stranger, whose presence at this place no one had suspected, crossed Creek Glycerine, which separated the plateau from the forest and bounded up the opposite bank. Herbert was there face to face with a fierce jaguar, similar to the one which had been killed on Reptile End. Suddenly surprised, he was standing with his back against a tree, whilst the animal, gathering itself together, was about to spring. But the stranger, with no other weapon than a knife, rushed on the formidable animal, who turned to meet this new adversary. The struggle was short. The stranger possessed immense strength and activity. He seized the jaguar's throat with one powerful hand, holding it as in a vice, without heeding the beast's claws which tore his flesh, and with the other he plunged his knife into its heart. The jaguar fell. The stranger kicked away the body and was about to fly at the moment when the settlers arrived on the field of battle, but Herbert, clinging to him, cried, "No, no, you shall not go." Harding advanced towards the stranger, who frowned when he saw him approaching. The blood flowed from his shoulder under his torn shirt, but he took no notice of it. "My friend," said Cyrus Harding, "we have just contracted a debt of gratitude to you. To save our boy, you have risked your life." "My life," murmured the stranger, "what is that worth? Less than nothing." "You are wounded." "It is no matter."